I mean, those federal Liberal Victorians have the distinct honour of being part of a federal government that's apparently very perfect. I mean, in all the governments across the entire globe, our government apparently has made not one mistake, and there's not a mistake that has been made that can't be forced onto the states, which is just ridiculous. The federal government made a number of missteps through this, and they've never fronted, and they've never done what Jenny Mikakos has done, which is to step forward and acknowledge that things could be done differently and better, and we don't get that. We got slow roll out of the public information campaign, slow roll out of pop-up testing, slow roll out of the wage subsidies, had to be dragged to their feet and still haven't involved themselves in the Royal Commission, the Commission of Inquiry into Ruby Princess, had to be dragged away from supporting Clive Palmer's border challenge. I mean, there's at least half a dozen things that they've stuffed up. And on top of that, this disastrous super scheme that they've put in, the early release super scheme that they've put in place. And you've never heard anything out of these federal Liberal MPs acknowledging missteps. Everything gets blamed to the states.
Does any of that compare, though, in consequence to what happened in hotel quarantine in Victoria?
What hotel quarantine and quarantining generally that is managed or supposed to be managed under the Biosecurity Act under a federal government, which basically they've again walked away from. They haven't accepted responsibility for quarantining.
The states agreed to take control for this, though, including Victoria.
And there's also a report that the Victorian Premier raised in the National Cabinet the need for quarantining, in spite of the fact that if it was left to the feds, we'd be doing self-isolation as opposed to having a much more rigorous approach to this. The states, let me just make this point, the states acknowledge that they needed to do better. I mean, the test is Victoria has a commission of inquiry or a special inquiry going on. The New South Wales Liberals set up a commission of inquiry into the Ruby Princess, and the feds, tellingly, have not done anything in relation to Ruby Princess of the sort, not acknowledged their responsibility in that disastrous event. And that tells you the mindset of the federal government, which is that they're happy that mistakes get owned by the states, but they will not be accountable at a federal level themselves. Like I said, they think they're perfect.
Well, but just on the quarantine issue, I mean, you mentioned that perhaps the states brought up a need, reports of that, to have a strong approach to this, not just self-isolating. The fact is the Victorian government was responsible for this, and this was the biggest mistake we've had in COVID-19 and handling of it in this country.
And I think they have demonstrated too, Tom, that by setting up an inquiry into this in Victoria, and where Daniel Andrews has, in press conferences, said he accepts his responsibility as the Premier of that state to make sure that their response to this crisis is better managed. I mean, he's done that. But you haven't seen that out of Scott Morrison. You haven't seen that out of Peter Dutton or David Littleproud on Ruby Princess, despite, clearly that Border Force and the Department of Agriculture have a role to play, particularly around that incident. You haven't seen them. All you have seen, I might add, is them go after journalists at press conferences and make very personal attacks through their questions of journalists rightly doing their job in questioning the federal government about where they accept responsibility. And I just think they've got to stump up better for the mistakes that they've made. Like I said, there've been at least, I can rattle off at least half a dozen, and I'm sure there'd be wiser people than myself that can point to other ones as well.
You rattled off early access to superannuation. Why is that definitively a mistake? It's only just happened. Plenty of people, I'm sure, out there access the money for something vital, and they were pleased to be able to do so. So why is that a mistake?
The federal government took their sweet time to put in measures to support people through the crisis. So, for example, they dragged their feet on wage subsidies, and in the interim, what they did is they offered up this early super scheme as a way for people to get some sort of support. $44 billion has gone out. Let's be clear about this. Over 500,000 people have completely drained their superannuation savings. Most of them are young people. 44 billion of wealth drained out of the system longer term. This will mean that there's less for people to live off in their retirement. They'll probably have to work longer. The community will have to foot the bill as more people go on to the age pension. This has been an unmitigated disaster of a policy, and it is not, despite the federal government saying, oh, this is your money, treat superannuation like it's an ATM and take it out to support yourselves. This is very anti-aspirational too, I might add, because people have less to live off. If they were living off super as compared to the age pension, Tom, they'd have a lot more money to be living off in their retirement. There'd be a lot more money in the system, in the savings pool to support investment by business when we get out of this. And ultimately, when more people go onto the age pension, we'll be stumping up the bill for that as taxpayers down the track. This has been a disastrous policy.
Well, but when you say disastrous, again, how can you be so definitive about that? How do you know what people have used the money for across the board? We've had estimates, for example, coming out from surveys, but what about someone that's accessed this to continue paying off a mortgage but support the rest of their family because even with the wage subsidy they were on an effective pay cut? I mean, what's wrong with that as a use of money?
Well, let me say this. I mean, there were also instances where we were asking the banks, and a lot of banks did help in terms of mortgage holidays and trying to defer and avoid that type of pressure being put on people, one.
But people might have opted not to go down that path. I just want to jump in there because I want to make this point. The money still accrues on that loan, and that adds time to the home loan, so that might not necessarily be a good decision. I mean, the decision to make between people, and if they decide I don't want a longer home loan, then is that fair enough in terms of their access to super?
So a lot of people were benefiting from mortgage holidays, and a lot of banks had said that they were extending those. And if you put to me the example of money being used for mortgages, I'll also put the examples to you where some of the data has been put up where it's been used for discretionary spend rather than actually getting people out of a jam. And if people are using super to get out of a jam, which I can totally understand some people were doing, this begs the bigger point as to why the federal government took so long to put in place measures to support people through the crisis when we were saying earlier that they should do it. And this is what I was saying, alluding to earlier, Tom. This government has not had a perfect response to this. This superannuation policy is a mistake that will be borne by future governments in dealing with the fact more people will have to go onto the pension because the government today did not support people properly and forced them to dig into their savings, and over 500,000 people have drained their super savings, and they're going to have to work longer, well beyond their retirement, to make up the shortfall. As I said, this is terrible longer term. This is a terrible cost to the nation.